So we're the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, and our mission is to foster engaged, innovative research into placed histories and communities across all regions and periods. So from the rural to the urban, from the parish to the metropolis. And our emphasis is on the localised, the micro-historical and the site-specific. We're home to projects like the Victoria County History of England that's been running for over 120 years, or projects like the digital crowdsourced mapping project Layers of London. And we work together with others to develop imaginative new approaches to making history and hopefully identifying opportunities for history to make a difference in the real world today. So in today's seminar, it's my great pleasure to introduce a recent centre project and our wonderful collaborators on that project, the Museum of Youth Culture, as well as 3 of the wonderful early career research interns who we co-supervised on this project, setting the record straight. And for us in the centre, this was a fantastic opportunity to collaborate in a different way from some of our previous work, to learn from a really exciting research and engagement venture, the Museum of Youth Culture, and to think about people, place and community in really new ways. So in a moment, I'll introduce our panel. We're going to begin with very short micro presentations from each of our panelists. We'll then move to a little bit of panel discussion just to get things going. And then we'll open out to general questions from all of you and some fuller discussion. When the time comes, just as a heads up, you'll have 2 different options for asking a question. You can either raise your hand using the participants function that you might be familiar with, and I'll come to you and you can ask your question on camera. If you're not happy with speaking on camera, you can also drop your question into the chat box and I'll pick it up from there. Please, though, do hold your questions until I invite them in case they get missed or lost in the chat box before that. Feel free to discuss and respond and engage in the chat box during the session. That's always lovely. And of course, if you're that way inclined, please feel free to tweet as we go on. You can use our handle at CHPPC_IHR, and all our other speakers and collaborators, if you want to drop your Twitter handles or hashtags into the chat as well for people to pick up on, then that's brilliant too. So first of all, I am delighted to introduce Jamie Brett and Lisa de Wedwa from the Museum of Youth Culture, and they're going to introduce the museum and archive and its Setting the Record Straight project. So I'll hand straight over to you, Lisa and Jamie, to do that. Over to you.
Thank you. Everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to meet you. I'm Lisa.
I'm Jamie.
And yeah, as Catherine said, we're from the Museum of Youth Culture. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction to who we are, the Museum of Youth Culture is an emerging museum that celebrates the sounds, styles and movements that have been forged by young people over the last 100 years. Kind of at the heart of our collections, it's a photographic archive of over 150,000 images that document youth culture movements from the last 100 years, whether that's, you know, the mods and the rockers going all the way up to grime and emo movements that are a bit more recent. And the archive really started out of this realization that no one was trying to gather this amazing story of growing up in Britain. No one was trying to collect these youth culture stories. It was maybe not seen as important as other areas of social history. And I think that kind of work to try and preserve this story and celebrate it as being important has kind of sat at the center of our work for the last 20, 30 years. About 2 years ago, we really started in our fullest our mission to build the world's first museum of youth culture and really create a space that's dedicated to youth culture histories. And as part of that, we also launched our Grown Up in Britain campaign, which is a crowdsourcing campaign that really just asks the public, what are your strongest memories of growing up? You know, from first jobs to first loves, to, you know, family holidays to Saturday hangouts. You know, we've all been young, and therefore everyone can be part of the Museum of Youth Culture. And it was really as part of the work we were doing for that project and for kind of building this future museum that at the beginning of last year, we launched Setting the Record Straight with the help of Heritage Lottery funding.
Yeah, and setting the record straight has been sort of quite an apt project at the moment, especially sort of considering recent events in society and sort of people realizing that a lot of narratives have been sort of missed out of museums and missed out of archives in general. You know, building a radical museum and calling ourselves a museum of youth culture already has a lot of connotations to it. And we're really keen to sort of ensure that when a museum does eventually open, that museum is sort of representative and maybe challenges what we already know about the term youth culture. You know, we've always been keen to sort of steer away from the traditional narrative, which often involves subcultures, often involves sort of key figures, and often involves sort of like a very sort of stereotypical sort of post-war narrative that youth culture follows. So we launched Setting the Record Straight, like Lisa says, with the help of the National Lottery Fund, to sort of say that you know, the archive that we have at the moment, the 150,000 images and assets we have, maybe they don't represent youth culture in the best way, or in a holistic way as they should. So the project involves sort of inviting thinkers and inviting members of the public to start to bring in images that maybe steer away from that classic image of the punk or the classic image of the raver, but starts to look at everyday people and how that might fit in with the archive. So it's been a real pleasure sort of working with the Institute of Historical Research and working on this project, because you know, for a small museum and a small team of like 4 of us, being able to work with such an established and sort of renowned institution has been an exciting project, and working with a series of really fascinating academics as well, who have joined us to sort of create their sort of their essays on this topic. So the whole idea has been, how can we look at areas of sort of turned stones in youth culture and actually start to sort of delve into what the youth culture narrative of the UK could look like when this museum opens physically. So it's been a really exciting sort of big starting point in terms of challenging ourselves, but also realizing that you know, the museum is for everybody. You don't necessarily have to be a mover and shaker to be in this collection.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lisa and Jamie. Brilliant, concise introduction. And I'd love to come back when we begin our discussion to some of those ideas you raised about, you know, doing things differently, being a radical museum,
Sure.
what it might mean to set the record straight, and how all these different research projects, you know, help you advance that goal as well. So that's fantastic. Thank you. So I'm now going to introduce the first of our research interns, and that's Elena Barnett. Last year, Elena completed a PhD in food history at Cambridge, and she's published quite widely on food in the early modern period. So this project has taken her in a really interesting direction, I think, because, you know, transferring some of her expertise and insights in food history and the social histories of food to, well, you'll see, quite different contexts and periods. So Eleanor, do set up your screen share if you want to do that. And I will hand over, and just warning everyone, this is a whistle-stop tour with all of our presenters today of their research projects. Over to you, Elena. Thank you so much.
Unmuted, okay.
Perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. As you say, my research project looked at the role of fast food in youth culture in Britain from around 1970 to 2000, using the Museum of Youth Culture's fabulous image archive, as well as quite a substantial survey in which I recorded the food memories of those who were teenagers in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So, there you go. So, fish and chips emerged as the most popular fast food throughout this period, with around 52% of participants remembering eating fish and chips with some regularity in their youth. And I included here this wonderful quote from John from Bolton, who was a teenager in the 1970s, and he recalled fondly how they used to give a bag of scraps, so bits of fried batter scooped out of the fryer, for free. And he says the chippy was the main option for fast food. Any unwanted chips could always be used to throw at friends. But whilst fish and chips remain the kind of traditional British fast food, the period from 1970 to 2000 witnessed significant lasting changes on how we eat in Britain. So those becoming teenagers at the start of this period were born into a society really quite recently recovered from wartime food rationing. And when kitchen appliances that we see as essential today, like fridges, microwaves, were really rarely seen in British homes. But in this period, we have quite a lot of social economic change, technological advances, an increase in immigration into Britain, as well as global travel outside of Britain, which led to this rise of fast food. So, you know, quick, cheap food that could be eaten on the go. American fast food chains like Wendy's, McDonald's started to take root really in the 1970s, and Indian and Chinese restaurants serving cheap takeaways also rapidly expanded in number in this period. Many from the survey remembered the novelty of trying these foods for the first time, including Ruth in the 1980s, who was really disappointed that the McDonald's cheeseburger she tried wasn't just a lump of cheese. And the Chinese chippy also emerged in this period, selling a mixture of chips, curry, and other junk foods, again, to a kind of predominantly teenage client base. Now, my research explored how fast food restaurants acted as important social spaces for groups of young friends. So many remembered, for example, kids bunking off school to eat chips and curry sauce at these kind of Chinese chippies, for example, and that these groups of friends kind of took symbolic ownership of certain establishments. Fast food restaurants also acted as sites of teenage romance, a common location for first dates, and particularly popular seems to have been cheap American-style milkshakes. And their role as sites of youth employment has often been overlooked in the literature. So here's Owen, who kindly submitted this picture of his first day working at Wendy, or now Wendy's, in the late 1980s in London. And he remembers his shoes sliding on the pavement after his shifts because of all the grease in the restaurant. So in this period of rapid change, new ways of eating, including this rise of fast food and the accompanying decline of the traditional family meal, were viewed by some as to blame for stereotypical youthful rebellions and even the breakdown of social order. So as in this quote from the early 1970s, Magnus Pike, who was the scientific advisor to the government, wrote that teenage youths roam the streets and magistrates complain that their parents exert too little influence over their behaviour. And he said the marvel of food technology makes it unnecessary for them to go home for their meals. And participants in the survey also continually look back on the conflict between the expectations of their parents and the types of food consumption that they were drawn to themselves as young people, like Tracy here, who remembers her parents being quite ridiculously conservative about food. And a particularly common conflict seems to have been parents who disapproved of their children eating by standing up, especially ice cream. For some reason. But my research really complicates this kind of negative narrative of fast food consumption, showing instead that it played a central role in stories of youthful fun and friendship, as well as teenage rebellion. So it provided the social glue for first dates, after school meetups among mates, drunken nights out at university. And as such, fast food establishments often marked distinctly youth spaces, which played an important role in young people's social and economic lives. Today, if you Google fast food and teenagers, you'll also be hit with a kind of barrage of frenzied reports about the health and social implications of young people's diets. So for example, there was a Daily Mail article a couple of years ago that suggested that the police should bribe teenagers with junk food in exchange for good behaviour. Which really shows, I think, the kind of connection between what people eat and the moral implications of their consumption. But as a part of the kind of wider Setting the Record Straight project, my research moves away from these enduring generalizations and stereotypes surrounding young people, highlighting instead the diverse experiences of fast food consumption and youth. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Eleanor. Thank you so much. An incredibly concise overview of what's such a rich topic, and it always makes me hungry, Eleanor, hearing you speak about your research. And brilliant to see those wonderfully rich images, the evidence that comes from the Museum of Youth Culture's archive. That's been such an incredible resource for all the researchers working on this project to explore these themes. So our next speaker, Lauren, if you want to begin sharing, and we'll be starting to move on. So there are lots of themes there, Eleanor, that I'd love us to pick up in discussion. Particularly, I know you thought a lot. You touched very briefly there on thinking spatially and thinking about space. That's something that resonates across a few of these projects. It'd be lovely to come back to that. But yeah, I love the way that you're wresting back quite negative narratives and looking at them in more detail. So brilliant. I will now introduce our next speaker, Lauren Eglin. Lauren's a PhD student at the University of Nottingham, and Lauren's main research area is in Black women's activism in the 20th century, but her project for setting the record straight enabled her to explore a topic that I think it's fair to say, can I say, Lauren, that is quite a topic quite close to your heart, that you've been able to explore from a research point of view. So I'll let Lauren take over. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Hi, thank you for having me, everyone. So I thought I'd start by talking a bit about how I came to this project, with it not being my main area of research. So I kind of came to the idea for this project after looking through the Museum of Youth Culture's image archive, and I was looking at the different youth cultures and groups, the environments that young people were occupying, and I started thinking about what these people were trying to say about themselves and how they were trying to say it. And one of the ways that I think we all express our personalities and communicate how we see ourselves, how we want to be seen by the outside world, is by the clothes that we wear. So I was thinking about fashion as a central way identity is performed and read by others, and how it's inherently linked to ideas surrounding race, class, gender, age, and sexuality. And that's kind of where my traditional, I guess, academic research interests come from, is ideas of identity. And while I was looking at the archive, I noticed that leopard print occurred across time periods and across the different youth cultures in the archive. And it might be because I am a fan of leopard print myself that I saw this, but I do think it's significant in the archive. And I started thinking about how it was used by all of these different youth cultures and how it took on different meanings, and it was read differently when it was worn by all of these different people. And I think it's fair to say that leopard print has always been a polarizing print. It's been considered high fashion and expensive. It can be trashy and tacky. It can make someone stand out, and especially more recently, I think it's being considered a neutral. And when we think about leopard print, and we can think about famous characters that wear them, we think of people like Jackie Kennedy in the 60s, Joan Collins, fictional characters like Pat Butcher and Bette Lynch, and then in the 90s, we've got Kate Moss, we've got Blondie's Debbie Harry in the 80s, and then obviously Scary Spice, Mel B as well. And all of these women are famous for their love of leopard print, yet each employ it in different ways and invoke different reactions from people. And these characters are really reflective of the contested and contradictory nature of the print worn by mods, punks, rockers, and drag artists in the archive, and by women young and old from every social background. And so my article, my essay, uses images from the archive to kind of explore the different meanings leopard print takes on when it's worn by these different people belonging to different youth cultures. It looks at the highly gendered nature of the print, with it being worn mostly, though not solely, by women, and also how age has ramifications for the way leopard print is read on the female body. A quick internet search when I was doing my initial research revealed an understanding of a wrong and a right way to wear leopard print, with this notion being inherently connected to age. Articles ask questions like, can you dress in leopard print and not look like a cougar, and how to wear leopard print at any age. I explore how women use leopard print for their own self-expression, and the association of leopard print with female sexuality, and subsequently how age affects how the print is read on female bodies, despite maybe women's personal motivations for wearing it. I also look at how class intersects with gender and age. George Plemper's portrait that we've got on screen, portrait of a mod couple, shows how a working class youth culture used the print to kind of rebel against the post-war austerity of their parents' generation, and the young woman's coat in the image is strikingly similar to that of Jackie Kennedy's, and paired with her chin-length bob, pearl necklace and kitten heels, stands in stark contrast to the council flat surroundings. And obviously it would be inaccurate to suggest that people of the working class merely emulated and copied fashion produced by wealthier upper class people and designers. And while mods wore the print to kind of project this rebellious respectability against the material conditions of their parents' lives, throughout the 70s and 80s, the leopard print really became a wardrobe staple for other youth cultures as well. And it came to voice their rejection of mainstream societal values. So the article goes on to look at how rockers use the leopard print as a component of their camp aesthetic in the 1980s, late 1970s, 1980s, that sought to subvert traditional gender codings of the feminine and the masculine. I look at how drag culture has also used the print in its challenge to the socially constructed categories of gender and sexuality. And I look at how punk youth employed it for all of its negative associations in its quest for an outrageous anti-respectability. And then I kind of go on to look at the 90s, when we kind of see leopard print become emblematic of a re-emergence, some would say, of feminism, espoused most famously by the Spice Girls in their rhetoric of girl power. Their use of leopard print is imbued with notions of women's independence, self-confidence, and a global sisterhood. And my piece kind of looks at how the explosion of leopard print in 90s popular culture saw women employ it to visually articulate their own powerful independence. And included in the article is a link to Shania Twain's That Don't Impress Me Much when she's got her full leopard print outfit on. And it also kind of looks at how, while leopard print is used by punks as a rejection of conservative capitalist society in the 80s, 90s feminism, and especially used by pop culture, kind of comes to embrace capitalism as feminism becomes, and leopard print becomes commodified. And then finally, it just kind of ends with a discussion of how today leopard print can be found everywhere and on every body. It's become such an enduring staple in the fashion industry that it is now considered a neutral by many. But the print does still continue to have an important part in youth culture and as a tool of personal and political expression. It continues, in my opinion, to accumulate meanings and to spark conversation. So that was just a quick whistle-stop tour of that.
That's fantastic, Lauren. Thank you so much. Again, what an immensely professional overview of your research. And I love the way, Lauren, that you introduced your project by, I wrote down, you said you were interested in looking at what people are saying about themselves. And I think that is so kind of intrinsic, isn't it, really, to you know, Lisa and Jamie, what's going on with this Setting the Record Straight project, that it's about getting away from those sort of externally imposed narratives and looking at how people self-identify, how they express themselves, how they perform and fashion their own identities. And it was a really brilliant insight into that in your presentation, Lauren. Thank you so much. Great. Well, we will move now to the last of our micro presentations, and then we'll start to open out into panel discussion and then questions and discussion across the whole room. So I'm going to introduce our final speaker and panel member, Jamal Langley. Jamal has research and professional expertise in social housing and homelessness, and I think that was a starting point for his interest in Grime for this particular research project. And across these internships, we were really keen to encourage imaginative and creative formats. And one of the wonderful things that Jamal has done, as well as the research itself, is bring some brilliant multimedia approaches to his topic that he's going to share with us today. So brilliant, Jamal, you're all ready to go. So I'll hand straight over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, hi there, everyone. My name is Jamal Langley. My research project was called Grime in Space. My kind of research aim was to consider why grime had come out of council estates, or specifically East London council estates in the early 2000s. I can't really imagine it coming from anywhere else. I can't imagine grime developing in Richmond or Oxford or Cambridgeshire. It's very East London. It's very London, and it's very concentrated around these council estates. So here I've got a picture. So most of the pictures I've used in my presentation were from Simon Wheatley, who was a photographer who went round and took pictures of the emerging grime scene in the early 2000s. And here we've got two of the kind of godfathers of grime, Dizzy Rascal and Wiley. And Dizzy Rascal was actually from the estate that's in the background there, which is the Crossways estate in Tower Hamlets in Bow. And I kind of wanted to understand, why grime had developed there. But what also, as soon as I started studying it, I realized that people aren't just part of the spaces where they live. They're also connected to other spaces. And I'm sure you guys kind of understand that a bit more now, all joining me through the internet. Nobody just inhabits kind of the physical location where they are, which made me interested in the idea of Paul Gilroy and the Black Atlantic. So most of the grime artists are kind of second or fourth, third generation immigrants. And I was wondering about that influence. And Paul Gilroy has this idea, this imagined community called the Black Atlantic, which is made up of a kind of diaspora of African people in Europe, in America, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, and in Africa. And kind of the main way he says that this kind of diaspora or this community or identity works is through music. He says that like kind of these people have a joint identity through music. Not to say it's only imagined. It's not like a solid thing. So I was interested to see kind of, has grime spread to the Americas? And the first thing I found is lots of reactions to grime by African Americans. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. There's lots of African Americans making content based on grime. So maybe this thing called the Black Atlantic does exist. And I found this video by this YouTuber called Favor, which I'm about to play for you. And it made me doubt the Black Atlantic a bit. So. If you can't keep the building, just be honest. Can never die, I'm Chuck Norris. The government and fuck Boris, yeah. I'm a villain.
He just said F the government and Boris. Who's Boris? The king's or queen's brother or something?
Yeah, so there is some local knowledge that you do require to listen to grime. It does require you to kind of be in the UK. So there are some areas where Americans do not understand it. And that was it's what I found quite across a lot of these American videos. It was kind of, rather than watching it for feeling any affiliation with grime, it was more that it was a bit exotic for them, and it was good because it meant that they could create content for other audiences in the UK. But then I also found this video of her reacting to another grime artist called Dave, and here he's doing a song about Black Lives Matter, and she responds like this.
He's talking about history, our history.
So in this example here, she calls it our history. So there is this kind of shared community, and I think that's a bit of evidence of the Black Atlantic. And you know, when we had Black Lives Matter last summer, we had lots of protests all around the world, and there was a lot of people saying the experience of Black people in America. I feel that experience here as well. There was a lot of talk in the Black community about racism, and a lot of experience being shared in all these different places. So Gilroy says that the Black Atlantic is connected by music, and I've mapped out a nice map here for you of all the different areas of music, coming from West African folk music through to calypso, reggae, dancehall, jungle, and you can see all these different ways that you can reach grime music. Each of these musics at their time were kind of rebellious, anti-mainstream, but over the years they've become more and more mainstream. I was listening to someone the other day and they were saying reggae is now probably considered the whitest music of all. So I wanted to understand how and why grime developed. Why did it develop separately from UK garage? Why didn't we just continue with UK garage? What led to this advancement into grime? What were the kind of societal situation like in the early 2000s? So I interviewed some grime artists, and here's a little clip from my movie. The first grime artist we got up is called Dogzilla. He's from Dagenham, and the second one up is from Hackney, and his name is Ears MC.
I've always listened to hip hop and rappers, and obviously my upbringing wasn't about happiness. My upbringing wasn't about getting girls and partying and being a happy, good chappy. Do you know what I mean? My upbringing was more of a relation to what the rappers were saying. In my head, it was more of like, I want to talk about this because this is what I'm going through. I can't say I'm happy when I'm not happy. I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to be an angry dude on a garage tune.
Garage started to get a little bit darker. So like with Wookie, and it started to get a little bit more dark instead of all that bright, you know, happiness, happy vibes. It started to get a little bit more gritty and dark. It was more of my reality. It was more to how I was feeling. You know what I'm saying? The sounds were definitely representing how I was feeling, and you know, I was listening to.
So he just continues to say how he started listening to kind of darker garage music, but he didn't feel right MCing over garage music. It was too light, too fluffy. So when he heard like grime instrumentals coming out, it felt right for him. Both of those MC I've just shown you grew up in council estates, and this is the picture taken by Simon Wheatley of a council estate during the early 2000s, and a lot of them at the time were kind of run down. So we had this process. I wanted to kind of know, why were council estates run down? Why were they stigmatized? Were they always like that? So as part of my research, I looked, I spoke to John Brockton, who wrote, what did he write? He wrote Council Estate Dreams. No, he didn't write Council Estate Dreams. Sorry, I spoke to this historian, and no, it's called Municipal Dreams. He wrote Municipal Dreams, and in Municipal Dreams, he kind of documents how council estates became run down. I'm sorry, someone's talking there.
Sorry. You're listening to your program? Yeah, I'm doing it. I'm going to go and sit in the other room now.
I don't know if we can mute them. Yeah, so he looks at the kind of, am I muted now? No. Yeah, so he kind of looks down how council estates became run down. During the Thatcher era, you had the right to buy. You had people selling their council accommodation. So what you had is fewer council accommodation available. So you had this process of residualization where we gave council accommodation to the most desperate. So it led to these rundown estates, and that can be heard in the music. The music is called grime. It's dirty. The next way is through these pirate radio stations. A lot of them were located in council estates. I'll just move on from there. And then the third way was within the lyrics of the music. I'm going to skip this as well, just because I think I've overrun my time a bit. But within the lyrics of the music, you can hear a lot of the kind of neoliberalism of Thatcher. It's very individualistic. It's very different from the reggae music that came here in the 70s. And in the shadows, I'm going to skip that. But in the shadows of kind of the Crossway estate, where Dizzy Rascal and this group called Rough Squad grew up, you can see Canary Wharf here in the background. So I think this picture kind of ties in that kind of that local feel, but then there's also this this global big financial market in the back. Well, sorry, it's basically the hybridity between the local and the global, where that's how grime developed. That's what I'm kind of arguing. And I've created a documentary for it, which should be coming out next month, where I've got interviews with lots of grime artists, lots of academics, and yeah, it kind of explores those ideas there. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamal. That's really fantastic, and many of you here will know that, of course, those two threads really of local history and urban history have been really crucial to this seminar over many years, and certainly to this Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. It's wonderful to see the way you're exploring those in your project, Jamal, particularly everything you're saying there about those kind of overlapping and intersecting spaces and identities and real and imagined spaces and communities. And I know Municipal Dreams has featured in this seminar and in discussions here before. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Right, so we're going to move now to a little bit of discussion amongst the panel to sort of get us warmed up, and then we'll start to take questions from the floor. First of all, can I thank all the panelists for those just exemplary, super professional glimpses into their projects, and hopefully you can now pick up on further details as we discuss some of the themes together. I wanted to pick up on a question that we saw in the chat already. Someone was asking if it'd be possible to share screen grabs of any of your slides. So can I leave that to the panelists before the end of this seminar? If you are happy, if you could just drop that into the chat. And of course, we understand that some of you might not be for various reasons. And Lisa and Jamie, if you want to contribute anything on that in terms of images that are being used, I'll leave you to put something into the chat there. So yeah, it'd be really nice to open up some discussion amongst the panel. So I suppose I wanted to start with a really broad question for all of you, but maybe Lisa and Jamie kicking us off, which is thinking about the mission and the scope of the Setting the Record Straight project. You've touched on this, but could you tell us more about what you think has been inadequate or unsatisfactory about the way that the histories of youth cultures have been told in the past, or haven't been told? You already hinted at things that are kind of missing in museums and histories, and our interns as well. I wondered if you could contribute, you know, just crystallize for us what you think your project does in terms of addressing some of those inadequacies or doing things in new and necessary ways. So Lisa and Jamie, I'll let you start off.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's quite interesting because one of these sort of initial starting points from sort of setting the record straight together was sort of steering away from the sort of sociological history that's been put together on youth culture. So in a way, steering away from academia. But we've actually turned back to academia again to help us like sort of solve that question, because academia is the place where those questions tend to be criticized and developed and moved on. So, you know, looking at that sort of, one of the things that I think we always found in the early days of sort of turning this into a museum was we were getting the same sort of people that were sort of looking at our images or engaging with our images, and it tended to be people that are into revival youth cultures, like sort of, you know, mod revivals, or people that were even part of the punk scene. And of course they have their space within the archive, and we want to be able to sort of be at home for their memories. But at the same time, it felt like we were ticking boxes of only a very minute minority of people who could relate to those scenes. And that felt like the very opposite of what a museum should do. A museum should be for everybody. So in a way, we've turned from, you know, like the sort of subcultural model that we often all see as gospel, which is the World War II happened, and then, you know, young people were given that freedom after that. And then obviously you have like the rockers and the Americans influence, but we've sort of realized that the archive goes back further. I mean, we've now got the 1920s in the archive, and that was when our, you know, blew our minds, because we were like, all of a sudden we're 100 years of youth culture. And obviously having these sort of amazing discussions with we have sort of researchers getting involved, that sort of started to just show that it's a much broader spectrum than just the sort of easy to follow story. It's going to branch off in all sorts of different ways, and I think this is the beginning of it.
I think a really nice thing about all these three kind of projects, and you know, we had a really difficult time actually narrowing it down because we had so many submissions and they were all really incredible. But I think the thing for us that really drew us to these different proposals was that they look at youth culture through a theme, but it also enables us to go across movement and across generations. So it's not just looking very specifically on one story, but it's actually looking much more widely, and it helps us connect different strands from the archive in one place. So it's helping us move away from chronologies, which we're really trying to do, and actually look at kind of shared youth experiences and how space and sense of identity plays into that. And I think these three research pieces all touched on that in different ways. And I think that's really where we start seeing a very different narrative to what we had before.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you so much. That seems like a perfect moment to hand over then to our researchers as well. And I don't know what your responses to this are. You know, you're all very much doing what Lisa's just described, something so specific. I mean, I think, you know, I love the way leopard print is. My goodness, that is so specific, isn't it? A print on a garment, but it's opened out to something so much bigger. You're all dealing with specifics, but telling much bigger stories. How do you feel your projects are setting the record straight, or doing something different in the telling of these stories? Does anyone want to have a go at responding to that? Elena.
I'll go. Okay. Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned, the kind of narrative that I am kind of working against is one that still exists today, which is that teenagers, you know, spotty teenagers eating their burgers, you know, makes them antisocial or even immoral, and that discourse is still, I think, present in the media today. So as I said, my project moves away from that by showing that fast food could be a lot of things. It could be a rebellious thing, but it could also, and very often was, something about fun and friendships and so on. So to kind of see fast food in a more positive light, and therefore stories about what being a teenager was also in more positive light. And I think the other thing was that, for me at least, when I think of kind of youth culture emerging, it tends to be, you know, like you say, subgroups, punks or something, who have particular fashions or particular particular music, and so on. But I do think that food culture is not given as much attention as something distinctly part of youth culture. And I think a good thing about the projects working all together is that we see that music, fashion, and food are all things that contributed to particular identities and particular friendships.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And it is a lovely mix of projects that we get, as you say, those three really different but so interrelated dimensions. Jamal or Lauren, do you want to come in on that? You don't have to come in on every question, but it's an opportunity if you want to comment. Lauren?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think I saw leopard print as a really interesting way to kind of see how we do have these assumptions about different youth cultures, and how fashion is a central way that all of these youth cultures are kind of identifying themselves to each other and to the wider world. But then how you take this one print and it seems to be everywhere. It seems to be in all of the different, I guess, youth cultures that would be traditionally categorized. And so I think looking at something, I guess, as small as leopard print kind of makes us question, well, why are they using the prints in this way, and how are we viewing them differently, and why do we view different people wearing the same thing differently? So I think it does open up broader questions rather than looking at distinct categories of people, if you would call it that, or subcultures of people, and just really looking at, as well, a topic in history that I would say isn't necessarily taken as seriously, and just really looking at the relationship between fashion and identity and how it's central to all of these different people.
Thank you. I certainly remember when Lauren was really immersed in her research project, I was shopping, and in my local Tesco Metro, there was a pack of leopard print face masks for sale by the till. And, you know, I saw that in a completely different way, Lauren. I realized there were so many ways we could kind of read how they signified in popular culture. Jamal, is there anything you want to add, or we'll move on?
Yeah.
Great.
So something I enjoyed about my project is that, because it's quite contemporary, a lot of the people that are around who created the grime scene in the early 2000s are still around now, and they can produce like a kind of counter narrative of how the grime scene was seen at the time. So in the mainstream press, we had people like David Cameron going out saying it was encouraging knife and gun culture. You had David Starkey on Newsnight during the London riots in 2011 saying the whites had become black, a particular sort of nihilistic gangster culture. But then on the other side, when I'm talking to these MCs, they were people with not much to do. They were out of work, and they created an entire genre of music with not much. Without any resources really. So I think it's quite it's just quite an encouraging narrative of people who didn't have anything being able to create this whole genre, and it kind of goes against what the media says of them. And also it's weird how in the early 2000s grime was so demonized, but then by 2012 you had kind of Dizzy Rascal at the Olympics performing. You've got Stormzy, who was number one for quite a substantial time in 2019. So that music has now become mainstream, and now we have a new music for kind of the youth in London called drill, and it's just following the same narrative. I talked to a DJ called KDK who is on a radio station, and she DJs in grime, and I asked her what she thought of grime or of drill, and she didn't like drill at all. She said it was violent, it was nihilistic. She kind of echoed what David Starkey had said about grime 10 years ago. But then when I talked to people who made drill music, they said they were just talking about their own reality. And it kind of goes back to UK hip hop in the 90s. Before that, reggae music. Everyone thinks they're just talking about their own reality, but then the next generation just doesn't understand, I guess.
That's fascinating, Jamal. Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, I've got loads of questions I'd like to ask. I'm really interested in particularly the spatial dimensions of all these projects. You know, you're thinking about spaces of fast food. Jamal, you spoke absolutely fascinating what you had to say about really, really local spaces, from specific housing estates right through to kind of global context for Grime. And I should mention that Emily, our fourth intern in the project, who's not here with us today, has also been investigating a very specific space. She's been investigating a specific moment too, the opening night of the gay superclub Heaven. So another kind of really interesting kind of spatial dimension. I might hold that for now. Maybe that will come up during the questions. I think I'll ask just one more before we open to the floor. So now could be a moment if you want to drop anything into the chat ready, or you can raise your hand and I'll come to you. But I wanted to ask one last question. So this comes back to where you started us off really, Lisa and Jamie, where you talked about the ambition of the Museum of Youth Culture to be a kind of radical museum, that you're an emergent museum, that at the moment you're kind of virtual but seeking a permanent home. And I should let everyone know that the museum you've had a brilliant pop-up shop, haven't you, recently on Carnaby Street that you've just closed down. And I should say that Eleanor, excitingly enough, Eleanor's essay for this project on fast food and youth spaces was blown up to huge proportions and displayed on the wall of that space, which is a wonderful bit of impact for her research and really exciting. But I wanted to ask a sort of broader question about what has it meant to be a virtual museum? How has that enabled you, or forced you, I guess, to be radical and to do things differently? In what ways, you know, can you be different as a museum? Have you had to think imaginatively or innovatively about collections and engagement practice? And what insights do you think that's generated potentially for more traditional bricks and mortar museums? And how can they learn from that? And then a second part of that question to our research interns, because you've also been doing things very virtually over this last year because of COVID and lockdowns and social distancing. Your research has all been remote and using remote collections and online materials and the Museum of Youth Culture's online archive. So I'd love your reflections on what it has meant to research, to work remotely and virtually. What have been the takeaways and the lessons learned for you, I suppose, because that's something we're all going to be living with for a while, I think. So Lisa and Jamie, radical virtual museums.
I mean, I think we're in many ways in a really privileged position because we're building a museum from the ground up. So we can be really kind of out of the box in terms of how we envision that museum. And we have the ability to kind of say, okay, well, we're going to open a museum in the next couple of years. What is that museum going to look like, and how are we going to build that museum? And this project was part of that. It was really about us saying, well, what's missing? Where is the story lacking? And I think that's actually one of the most exciting things, is that we have the ability to be incredibly nimble and really see the museum as a living, breathing museum. We talk about kind of growing up in Britain and these stories that we're collecting as a collective memory. And it's going to be a museum that's constantly growing, that's also constantly traveling and kind of popping up in new places and kind of bringing in new stories. And I think because we're quite small, we've been really good at popping up all over the place and kind of adapting our collections to fit with the people that we're working with or the place that we're working in. So we can, maybe have a space on Carnaby Street that's really kind of busy and bustling and lots going on, but then we might pop up in Clacton-on-Sea in a tiny little store on the high street, where it's really about bringing the community together and sharing memories and stories. And I think that approach has served us really well, but I think it's also made the museum really very much a living collection. Yeah,
I think the lockdown hit us in a very experimental time, which is probably the best time for it to hit us, because we just got funding for a project literally as Lisa mentioned, sort of a couple of weeks before lockdown started, and that funding was reliant on us physically going to spaces, putting a scanner down and saying, show us your images, bring some images over. And we'll scan them. And that was our whole strategy. It was all about bringing in new photographs. It was all about sort of doing actual physical symposiums. And obviously today, this is one of those. And that's, another approach that we sort of didn't really know about doing before. So we just sort of learned how to do what we originally intended to do, which was to gather in images, build the archive, challenge the collection, but do it within the limitations of lockdown. And actually, I think that has become way more beneficial. And we've learned so much more from that, because we've realized that actually this coming year we don't really have to do anything physically if we don't want to, and that's been sort of quite a strange realization, because we're all about meeting people in person, but instead of sort of putting up a Facebook ad and then going to a pub and getting a scanner ready, we started a Facebook ad campaign instead, and we employed a marketing agency to help us do that. So in a way we've become a lot more agile, and I don't think we would have thought that we would have been so online focused, but it's made us realize that the museum is a lot less reliant on physical attendance than we thought before. So in a way, it's sort of taken some pressure off. But obviously, there's nothing better than having a physical launch party with everybody there, a big exhibition launch. So that's never going to go away. But it's still been really, really fascinating just seeing that we get 2,000 submissions just from putting an advert on Facebook and Instagram.
That is amazing. Yeah.
I think in the wider heritage landscape, hopefully moving forward, I think other museums and bigger museums will have realized that ways they can try and be more accessible, more nimble, and more responsive to what's going on. Because I think that's what really makes museums come alive, is when the person visiting can relate to what's on show, and it corresponds to their lives and their living experiences, and isn't just some far-fetched thing.
That's brilliant. And I can see you've already answered some questions that dropped into the chat by Victoria Dawson about exactly this, about your plans going forward and how COVID has affected what you've done. And, I've been so impressed by your work, because when I first encountered your work, I was really inspired by your scanning socials and your strategies for kind of meeting people where they are and engaging with them, and that you've been able to effectively translate that to online context, I think is tremendously impressive, and something that so many of us working in engagement and participation in different ways can learn from. Can I ask a really quick follow-up there? I'm quite interested. Have you found that there are issues around digital access at all, or digital exclusion? And that, have you got any strategies for, your pop-ups on high streets have been amazing, but there are some different lines of exclusion, aren't there, with working online? Is that something you're tackling?
I think we found, we thought there'd be more of a challenge. I mean, we tend to find that there's almost like a sort of, if it's like an image from someone who's elderly, that might come through the child of that person, or the son or daughter of that person. So in a way, we sort of access people that sort of second hand who aren't able to use technology. But alongside that, we have been creating physical boxes, and they've been sort of activity boxes that we've been sending out to care homes. Obviously, there's been all sorts of problems going on with care homes at the moment, as we know, and it's all been very complicated. But at times when we've been able to, we've had a sort of facilitator getting these boxes out, and then sort of starting to go for a series of activities that get people to talk about their youth, and then we record that. So that's sort of been the closest we've been thinking in terms of giving a sort of a facilitator a sort of set of activities that can get that content, or get that oral history uploaded to our website without actually having to use a computer. It's complicated, but there are ways around it.
It's such imaginative work, and kind of thinking both in the digital and non-digital formats for doing that kind of remote engagement.
We've got a free phone number at the moment. We have a 0800 number that people can call up and give us. I
think you should drop that into the chat right now, Jamie. And I will turn to our interns now as well. So, what has it been like embarking on these research projects at a time when everything has been kind of remote and virtual? What have been the advantages or the challenges? I mean, Jamal, you've been talking to people from all over the world, and I know interviewing has been really crucial to what you've done. Eleanor, you've also been collecting kind of oral histories and personal stories, Lauren, I think you've done some of that. I mean, how have you managed this? What are the lessons learned, I guess, from your experiences? Who wants to start us off? Jamal. We'll start with Eleanor and then Jamal then. Great.
Okay. So just very briefly, of course, making use of the amazing image collection was really the heart of the project. And, that's what also was the inspiration for the project, that when I was looking through them and I saw, some mods eating Mr. Whippy ice cream, and, then it snowballed from there. But just to kind of echo what the others have said about the power of social media, for me, I run History Eats on Instagram, which is a page dedicated to food history. And it really has become a community over the last year where, I could ask questions about this topic and get a quick response. And, that's how I kind of source interviews and the survey responses. So, I think it's just an amazing tool really to connect to people across the country and beyond.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? I think we're at quite a sort of it's quite an emergent point, I think, you know, at the moment, of using social media for research and for kind of ethnography and interviewing and oral histories in ways that obviously we didn't have access to before. Thanks. Jamal, over to you.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, so I think the fact that everyone's more used to talking on things like this, Zoom, has really helped me with my project, just because it made people more accessible, kind of. I think some of the people I interviewed for my for the film, if they weren't used to using Zoom, they probably wouldn't have agreed to do it before. I interviewed people in Australia, in Sweden. These are grime artists that have moved. I interviewed Diane Abbott. I don't know if she would have the physical time to talk to me, but if I'm just like, can I talk to her for 15 minutes over a quick Zoom? It was kind of an in. And so that kind of made researching easier for me. I did do some physical interviews, which were made more difficult by kind of COVID restrictions and having to be 2 meters apart and entering people's homes. But yeah, I've kind of enjoyed working in this way, and I think the museum is great. It's a great resource. You've got all the photos there and available. So yeah, I've enjoyed it.
Brilliant, thanks, Jamal. And Lauren, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, my project is very much built from the images themselves. So I guess just the circumstances that you, Jamie and Lisa, had to build the museum around were quite beneficial for my project, because the images are really the heart of the research. And I find the trend in digitisation, just that all of our research, really helpful, especially during this time.
That's great. I think you've all been incredibly resourceful and resilient in how you've approached this. We've got a couple of questions already, so I'm going to turn first of all to Lena, and I think you're happy to ask on camera, and then we'll move to Richard. So Lena, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the brilliant presentations and for like having this open forum. I'm really interested in space and my research, and I'm super happy to discover this. I have lots of questions, but I have a comment and a brief question for Jamal specifically. First of all, when you were showing this clip by the YouTuber who didn't really get the video, I was reminded of, I was teaching a spoken word poetry seminar last semester at my German home institution. And several of my German students had suggested Dave's Black Lives Matter performance to be discussed in the seminar. And they were like super involved. There were so many references, like for example, just the reference to Grenfell that they didn't get, but it's still, I think this, despite the fact that they didn't get it, this specific local space was still somehow created and very relatable to them, which I found super interesting. And that kind of leads to my question, because I was wondering how you decided to approach this local and global space then at the same time, because you mentioned that the Black Atlantic sort of doesn't necessarily work out. I'm guessing Imagine Communities and Benedict Anderson are an old hat. I'm wondering whether you have sort of maybe a trans-cultural, trans-local approach, or what you're thinking, like how would you describe this kind of space between the local and the global?
Just as, I guess, just space, because it's so hybrid now that there is no local and there is no global, I guess. I don't know, when I was at uni, there was lots of British people. They were really into like South Korean music and culture. They've never been to South Korea, no South Korean relatives, but they could stay at home and consume this. I thought is it K-pop? They could consume this K-pop. I know it's different from grime, but they could consume this K-pop, and they were part of that community, even though they were miles away. And I think there's, with the third and second generation grime artists, they've got more of a connection. It was part of their kind of, I guess, their primary socialization. While it's like Wiley and Footsie, their dads were in a reggae band together, so they had bass music around them all the time. But it doesn't even matter now. You could be, the way that identity is so kind of fluid these days, that you could, live in Britain your entire life, be from the home counties, but really get into K-pop on YouTube, and then all of a sudden you're part of that community. Does that answer your question at all? I guess I wouldn't say that I wouldn't describe the intertwining of it all. I would just say it is space, and it's hybrid now. It's global and local.
That's fascinating, Jamal. I was just thinking that there is no local is both very bad news for this research centre and also brilliant news for this research centre, and really fascinating thinking in those kind of hybrid terms that you're describing. It is great. Thanks. I'm going to hand over to Richard for his question now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all those presentations. I really enjoyed that. I wanted to ask a question about photography as a source and how each of the speakers uses photography, because we've seen different kinds of photographs in these presentations. There are the ones which are personal pictures, but they're quite self-conscious of displaying yourself in your leopard print or whatever. You've got the pictures which are just kind of snaps that are, could have been taken any time by anybody. And then you've got the ones which are very carefully posed publicity shots. Jamal showed us a picture of this band who were posed underneath the viaduct and with Canary Wharf behind, and that didn't just help to position them, it was there for a very specific purpose, I'm sure, in being a publicity shot for that group. So how do you actually connect these different kinds of photographs to people's everyday experience of what being young in a particular time in the 1950s, 1970s, 2000s is about?
That's great, Richard. Thank you. So thinking critically about these photos, using them as kind of mediated sources. Who wants to come in on that first?
Shall I jump in first just to talk a little bit about, I guess we almost have, in a small way, two collections within the Museum of Youth Culture. We have the archive that we've kind of collected over the last 20, 30 years that's working with professional archives that are either kind of social documentary collections or are kind of more portrait-based collections, but I guess they both kind of do the same thing in that they're kind of maybe outsiders or people that are in the scene, but are really trying to document this kind of moment in time. Whereas when we launched our Grown Up in Britain campaign, that was really about personal stories and personal photographs, and they can be really terrible photographs as well, but they tell a really amazing story, and they serve a bit more of a different purpose. And we almost see the photographers as being a skeleton, and all these different personal stories and personal photographs kind of telling those wider stories of those different experiences and how they correspond with each other. So it's definitely safe to say that we've kind of got two slightly different collections within the archive that kind of speak to each other and complement each other.
And we had a bit of a crisis when we first decided to ask images to come in from the public. We were thinking, is this going to work with the rest of the photographers, or the photographers that have been shooting their whole life specifically to document these scenes? Are they going to be happy to have their images alongside a snapshot, of someone that's just taken this image and taken a picture that's got a rip in it and sent it to us with a fold down the middle, and that's been one of the problems that we sort of struggled with to start with. It started as a technical problem. We have images that would be sent to us from Facebook, like saved from Facebook, and then sent to us as a tiny file. And then we wanted to exhibit it, but then we couldn't print it out big enough. So we had to find out ways around that. And there are ways around it. So it's been a bit of a journey for us, working out how they fit together. And to be honest, I don't think the symbiosis of those has quite been finessed yet, and we're still working that out at the moment. So it's interesting that you raised that question, because it's early days. It's only been a year really that we've started to take on new images that are sort of snaps from the public. We'll see how that starts to develop and fit in with the rest of it.
It's a really fascinating insights from a real kind of archives management collections point of view. Thanks. And please don't feel you all have to kind of comment and answer on every question, but for many of our researchers, do you have any thoughts on what it was like working with these photos and how you thought critically about them as sources?
Yeah,
Lauren.
I can jump in on one specific example I had, and especially looking at, I guess, the more professional photographer images. I was kind of looking at the photos along with the captions and the titles that I guess the photographers had given them. And there's one specific one that is tagged as a sexy girl club dancer dressed in leopard skin outfit showing cleavage. And I was kind of thinking in that, using that particular image to think how some people view leopard print and these ideas of gendered sexuality and hypersexuality with young women who wear leopard print and how they want to be perceived. And so I found it very interesting kind of looking at how the photographer-led images, I guess, thinking about how the photographers maybe perceive them. Is that the way that the person posing wanted to be perceived? So I think it brings up a lot of really interesting questions about the difference in who's taking the photograph and for what purpose. So that's something that I definitely thought about while trying to navigate through all the images.
That's such a brilliant example, Lauren. Thank you.
Just as well, we didn't write that, by the way. So that's one of the challenges of this project, has been going through images that have had photographer written captions from back in the day, and actually also, you know, trying to make sure that they're a little bit less racy and a little bit more just actually all-encompassing and not offensive, I think, because there are some old things in the archive that are sort of, you know, that are a bit outdated, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember really well, Lauren, when you were kind of negotiating, you needed to quote that caption in your piece, and you had to kind of negotiate the language of that. It's really fascinating. Any other comments on that? Jamal?
Right. Yeah, so one of the people I interviewed was Ellie Ramston, who contributed to, I think she's contributed now to the museum. She's got a range of photos of female grime artists. In a lot of the early photographs, there are no females. It was a very male-dominated space grime in the early 2000s. But in the early 2010s, you get more females in grime, and Ellie Ramston went around and documented them. And I noticed in a lot of her shots, there was the aesthetic that we would have seen in the early grime videos and like Channel U and stuff, which was a grime channel, which is the council estate. So my question to Ellie was kind of, did you place these people here and try to get that aesthetic? And she said no, she just went to where they lived and took the photos. So so I think they are kind of natural in a lot of ways, but then I think also she's trying to work collaboratively with her subjects, but I think her subjects know that they are trying to achieve this grime aesthetic as well. So whilst it's natural in some circumstances, people are also trying to achieve that aesthetic. And with my interview with Ears MC, he's got a video called 10 out of 10. It's on this estate, and I said to him, "Oh, do you live on this estate?" And he was like, "No, I was just walking past one day, and I knew it's what I wanted. It reminded me of where I grew up." I checked, and it did look kind of like the estate he grew up on, but there's an aesthetic as well people are trying to achieve.
That's fascinating, and also brilliant insight, Jamal, into how the interviews that you conducted with photographers and performers and musicians have really illuminated some of the other sources that you've been working with. Thank you. I'm going to move on to a couple of questions in the chat now, and I hope Lorenzo and Alex don't mind. I'm going to kind of fold these together because they're quite related. So they're questions initially for the museum, but others might want to comment on this as well, to do with outreach and engagement and participation. So Lorenzo asks, how easy or difficult was it for you to set up your photo scanning events and get people involved? Were you worried about how many people would show up and about engagement? And then Alex follows that up with some questions around, again, participation and collecting and involving people. So have you encountered any challenges around ethical collecting, particularly now when you're moving into online? Again, in terms of participation and contribution, do you ever offer incentives to take part? So I think all those questions cluster, don't they, around engagement and participation as strands of collecting. So it'd be great to hear your reflections.
I mean, the first time we did a scanning event, we were terrified because we didn't know who was going to turn up. And, we tried to, we put it out with, I think it was the Ace Cafe, yeah. Which is a motorcycle club in North London. And we put it out on their Facebook page. And obviously they've got a bit of a sort of cult following, and they've got people that come every weekend. But, the reality is sometimes you turn up at an event and you do get one photograph. Or sometimes you come at an event and you get someone that, that's got an entire photo album, and then there's a queue. And then there's more people. So we used to have that happening quite a lot as well. But that was sort of, in a way, moving things online has taken away the sort of risk of that, because it takes a lot of time and effort to put these events on. And sometimes, you don't know if someone's going to have their images. It's quite a specific thing to sort of ask of people to say, have you got a photo album ready that you want to include in the museum? But I think one of the things that we've always made sure in terms of submissions and people contributing is that they have a contract with us, and we try and make it as light-handed as possible, because we don't want it to be something that people feel that they are forced into or roped into for a certain amount of time. But going from the days when we used to function as an image library and as sort of an agency, we used to have quite heavy-handed contracts where it will be as they have to be, sort of saying that we represent these images for usage in whatever media we have the client come to us with. But nowadays it's more like the images come to us and we say, this is what we'll do with them, and it will be we'll put them on our website, for research purposes, and on our social media, and there might be a few more tick boxes that you can select other than that. So it might be to be involved in book projects that we do and things like that. But what we do is that whenever and sometimes does happen where we have images in our archive and a brand might come forward and say, for example, Fred Perry might say, we want to use this image as part of our campaign, and they give us some money for that. And then we'll then split that fee with the person who's submitted it. So there's quite a nice opportunity for people where actually we often the most sort of unlikely images end up getting chosen by a brand, and then sometimes I'll say no, and that's also fine. But it means that people do earn money through it, don't they? And yeah, I think we always say that we don't own the images. The images are sort of on loan, and if you want to take them out, you can. And I think the freedom that gives people makes people want to stay involved with the museum.
Yeah, we try and have a really nice, almost like collective relationship with the people that submit. And, in the end, they're really personal images. So we need to treat them as such and give them that respect, and, make sure that we have conversations with people. And, if we want to use an image, it's down to them as well. It's not, we don't take the copyright. People keep their own copyright because it's, these are really personal stories. So we have to treat them as such, and we have to think very much about the ethics behind it and making sure that people feel safe and comfortable with how their images are being used and where they're being shown. And it's a big responsibility on our part, but I think because we have quite a direct relationship with people that submit, I think that's really nice. We did an exhibition at Fred Perry store in Camden 2 years ago now, feels like, and it was just showing public submissions, and our guest list was everyone that submitted. So it was really nice because it was there was the kind of Fred Perry guest list, which is kind of like people in the scene, and then there was our guest list, which was people that had submitted, from people that were teenagers now to people that were in their 60s and 70s. So it was a really lovely mix, and I think that's where what we do becomes really powerful as well, where we get that kind of people coming together and sharing their memories. And it was such a lovely event because you had people proudly showing off their images to other kind of guests from Fred Perry that were coming down. And I think that approach has worked really well.
Wow, that sounds absolutely amazing. What an event. Thank you. And just really briefly, any of our researchers, if you have any reflections on that kind of engagement and participation, just any quick comments on that? I mean, I was certainly struck, Elena, in the kind of the calls that you put on social media, how there was such a lot of participation because people just, I think as you said, Lisa and Jamie, everyone has their own story to tell, don't they, about when they were young, and people are keen to share their own stories, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially with food, it's something that we all kind of relate to. And but I suppose, yeah, it's also making people feel comfortable if they don't remember things as well, in terms of the survey that I did, because I think some people felt a bit of pressure maybe to have remember what they had for dinner on, the 25th of May, 1982. So also, yeah, just being kind of open to just them telling their story in their own words is what I mean, and seeing where that leads.
Brilliant. That seems like perfect kind of last words for the seminar, actually. People telling their own stories in their own words or their own images, and seeing where that leads, because again, that seems to take us right back to the central mission of setting the record straight and the work of the Museum of Youth Culture, which is brilliant. So I'm going to start to draw things together. I've got a little bit of information to share at the end of the seminar. So first of all, I hope you'll all join with me in thanking our wonderful presenters today. You can share your reaction at the bottom of the screen in Zoom, or you can just do it, the traditional old-fashioned way. A wonderful array of different presentations and insights, and wonderful to learn some more about the really innovative and imaginative work of the Museum of Youth Culture as a radical emerging museum. So thank you everyone, and thanks for those in the room who've asked such interesting questions and contributed in the chat.